Welcome to this little corner of other people's lives. Sometimes someone else's truth is scarier than any fiction. Let's check. Sarah sat on the edge of the couch, fiddling with the hem of her gray sweater. The living room window was open, and the morning breeze brought in the scent of wet grass and the distant sea. She looked at Victor, who was sitting at the kitchen table as usual, his head buried in his laptop. His fingers tapped methodically across the keys, creating a rhythm that Sarah had memorized. It was a sound as predictable as their morning coffee, their evening conversations about the weather, their lives. She sighed, and the sigh seemed louder than she intended, because Victor looked up. "Everything okay?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. His voice was soft as always, with the same warmth that had once made her fall in love. But now it seems empty, like an echo in a room where no one lived anymore. "Yeah, I'm fine," Sarah said, forcing a smile. She always did that, forcing a smile on like an old mask that was starting to crack at the edges. "Just thinking." Victor nodded as if that explained everything and turned back to his laptop. Sarah looked at his profile, his neatly trimmed hair, the light stubble, the wire-rimmed glasses he only wore when he was working. He was handsome, dependable, and kind. Everything she'd ever wanted. And yet, looking at him, she felt something inside her tighten, like her lungs were refusing to breathe. It wasn't disgust or anger. It was absence. The absence of something important she couldn't name. She stood up, quietly, so as not to disturb his concentration, and went out onto the balcony. The city spread out before her gray rooftops, flashing signs, the distant hum of traffic. She was 32, and she felt like an old woman trapped in a young body. Once she had dreamed of writing books, traveling the world, dancing in the rain, like in stupid romantic movies. And now she was Victor's wife, a sales manager for a company that sold something no one needed, and a woman who cooked dinner every night and watched TV series to drown out the silence in her head. Something died, she thought, and the thought was so clear, so sharp, that Sarah shuddered. She didn't know what had died, but she felt it like an emptiness in her chest, like a cold that no blanket could warm. Was it love? Was it hope? Or was it herself? The next day, Sarah sat in Dr. Royce's waiting room. The office was in an old building with high ceilings and creaky floors that smelled of wax. The walls were covered with paintings of abstract splatter that Sarah thought looked like someone had spilled paint and decided to call it art. She leafed through a magazine nervously, not really reading it, until the secretary, a young woman with bright red lipstick, called her over. "Sarah Miller, the doctor is ready to see you." Sarah stood up, straightened her skirt, and walked into the office. Dr. Royce was a man in his 50s, with thick gray hair and eyes that looked like he already knew half your story just by looking at you. He was wearing a dark blue shirt, slightly wrinkled, which made him look less like a stern doctor and more like a university professor who forgot he had a lecture that day. "Good afternoon, Sarah," he said, gesturing to a soft chair opposite his desk. "Sit down. Would you like some water? Tea? I have some excellent chamomile tea. It calms you down better than any pill." Sarah smiled, though it was forced. "No, thanks. I'm fine." He nodded as if he didn't believe it, but didn't insist. "Good. Then let's begin. Tell us why you are here." Sarah hesitated. She had rehearsed this speech in her head dozens of times on the drive here, but now the words seemed foreign, inappropriate. She looked down at her hands, folded in her lap, and suddenly said, "I don't know where to begin. Everything feels wrong. My life, my marriage, myself. I don't know who I am, Dr. Royce. And it's scary." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze attentive but not oppressive. "What does it mean, wrong? Can you describe what you feel?" Sarah took a deep breath. She wanted to run, to hide, to say that she was wrong, that everything was okay. But instead, she heard her voice, quiet but firm. "Loneliness. I feel lonely. Even when I'm with my husband, with friends, with colleagues. It's like I'm in a room full of people, but no one sees me. And I don't know how to fix it." The word alone hung in the air, heavy as wet snow. It was the first time Sarah had said it out loud, and it was both liberating and terrifying. She waited for Dr. Royce to start writing things down, nodding, saying platitudes like, "This is normal," or "Let's figure this out." But he just looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that compelled her to continue. "My husband, Victor, he's wonderful. Really. Kind, caring, always does what he says he'll do. But with him, everything is so predictable. Every day is like a repeat of the previous one. We have breakfast, he goes to work, I go to work, in the evening we have dinner, watch TV, and go to bed, and so on in a circle. I don't know when it started, but I stopped feeling myself, like I'm dissolving in this routine." Dr. Royce nodded, but did not interrupt. He waited, and the silence was magical. Drawing from her words, she was afraid to even think. "Sometimes I look at him and think, who are you? Why am I with you? And then I feel terrible because he didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who broke, right? There's something wrong with me." "Do you think you're broken?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only curiosity. Sarah shrugged, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sleeve. "What else can I call it? I should be happy. I have everything: a house, a job, a husband who loves me, but I'm not happy. I'm empty." Dr. Royce leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "You know, Sarah, the word should is like a trap. You say you should be happy, but who decided that? Who wrote this script that says you have to feel a certain way?" Sarah blinked, not expecting that question. "I don't know. Society? My mother? Me? Everyone lives like that, don't they?" "Not everything," he smiled. "And even if everything is, it doesn't mean it's right for you. Let's try something. Tell me about a time when you felt alive. Not should, not right, but alive." Sarah thought about it. Her gaze slid around the room, stopping at the painting with the abstract spots. She remembered how, when she was 20, she had run away from home for the weekend to go to a music festival with her friends. They danced in the open air, drank cheap wine from plastic cups, and laughed until their stomachs hurt. She had felt free then, as if the whole world was hers, and she could do with it whatever she wanted. "It was a long time ago," she said quietly. "I was different. I dreamed, I believed that everything was possible. And now I just live, and it's not the same." Dr. Royce nodded, his eyes shining as if he had found something important. "Okay, that's something. Let's try to figure out what's changed. Not in your life, not in your husband, but in you. What makes you feel like you're just living?" Sarah opened her mouth to answer, but the words stuck. She didn't know, and that not knowing was the scariest thing. That evening, Sarah returned home. Victor was already there. Cooking dinner, it smelled of fried onions and spices. He turned as she entered and smiled. "How was your day?" he asked, stirring something in a frying pan. "It's fine," she replied, throwing her bag on the sofa. "And you?" "The usual. Busy, but nothing interesting." He turned to her, holding a wooden spoon. "Would you like some wine?" I opened a bottle of red. Sarah nodded, even though wine was the last thing she wanted. She looked at Victor, at his familiar movements, at his familiar voice, and felt the loneliness washing over her like a wave. She wanted to scream, to tell him that she felt bad, that she was suffocating, that she didn't know how to live. But instead, she took the glass he handed her and said, "Thank you. It smells delicious." He smiled, satisfied, and went back to cooking. And Sarah stood in the middle of the kitchen, clutching her glass, thinking about how easy it was to pretend everything was okay, and how hard it was to stop. At her next session with Dr. Royce, Sarah felt a little bolder. Maybe it was because she had already experienced the first conversation, or maybe it was because the word loneliness no longer seemed so scary. She sat in the same chair, but now her back was a little straighter, and her fingers were not fiddling with her sleeve as much. "I was thinking about what you said," she began, not waiting for his questions. "About should, and I realized that I really do live by some kind of script, like I should be a good wife, a good employee, a good daughter. But I don't know what I want." Dr. Royce smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that said, "I know everything," but rather the kind that said, I hear you. That's a big step, Sarah, to admit that you don't know what you want. Most people are afraid to even ask themselves that question. He paused, then asked, "What if you could want anything? If there were no shoulds?" Sarah laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. I don't even know where to begin. For so long, I was this Sarah, Victor's wife, the sales manager, the one who always says, everything is fine. I don't know who I am without all of that. Then let's find out, he said, and there was such confidence in his voice that Sarah almost believed it was possible. Let's start small. How do you feel when you think about your marriage? Not what you should feel, but what is. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to find words. I feel sadness, like I've lost something, but I don't know what. Victor hasn't changed, he's still the same. But I look at him and I don't see us. What was before, and I don't know how to get it back. Or if I want to get it back. Dr. Royce nodded and wrote something down in his notebook. That's fair. And it's a start. Sometimes, to find yourself, you first have to admit you're lost. Are you ready for that, Sarah? She looked at him, and a spark flickered in her eyes, uncertain, but alive. I don't know, but I want to try. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen, where a cursor blinked on a blank report. The office hummed with the usual noises, the click of keyboards, the hushed conversations, the smell of coffee from the coffee machine in the corner. She was supposed to be finishing up her quarterly sales analysis, but her mind was anywhere but the numbers. It was somewhere between her session with Dr. Royce the day before, where she had once again tried to sort out her feelings for Victor, and the strange feelings she got from watching her coworkers laughing at the water cooler. It felt like everyone around her was living their real lives, and she was just an extra in someone else's show. Sarah looked up with a start. Alex, a colleague from the marketing department, stood in front of her desk. He was tall, with a shaggy dark fringe that fell into his eyes and a smile that always seemed slightly cocky, as if he knew some secret that no one else could. He was wearing a shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing a tattoo on his forearm, an intricate design that Sarah couldn't help but stare at every time he was around. "I'm not sleeping," she replied, trying to hide her slight irritation. "I'm just thinking." "Oh, that's a dangerous business," Alex grinned, leaning on the edge of her desk. "Thinking about how to save the world or just what to order for lunch." Sarah rolled her eyes, but the corners of her lips twitched traitorously. Alex had always managed to make her angry and laugh at the same time. He was the complete opposite of Victor. If Victor was like a calm sea, then Alex was like a storm that destroyed everything in its path. And damn, it was attractive. "Maybe about how to stop you from distracting me from work," she countered, but there was no real anger in her voice. "Oh, you hit me right in the heart." Alex theatrically pressed his hand to his chest. "Okay, I came with an offer. Tonight, there's a corporate party at the loft. There will be music, cocktails, and dancing. Are you coming?" Sarah hesitated. Corporate events were never her thing. Loud crowds, drunk coworkers, awkward conversations, these usually made her want to run home and hide under the covers. But something in Alex's eyes, that bold, almost challenging look, made her pause. "I don't know," she said, looking away. "I have plans." "Plans?" Alex raised an eyebrow. "Sit at home and watch The Office for the 105th time. Come on, Miller, you're not that boring." "I'm not boring," she snapped, feeling the blood rush to her cheeks. I don't like crowds." "Then come for me," he said, and his voice suddenly became quieter, almost intimate. "I promise not to let you get bored." Sarah looked at him, and for a second it seemed as if the air between them had thickened, grown heavier. She looked away quickly, muttering something about thinking about it, and Alex laughed and walked away, leaving behind a faint scent of his cologne, something tart, with notes of wood and citrus. The evening came faster than Sarah expected. She stood in front of the mirror in her bedroom, examining her reflection. The black dress she hadn't worn in 2 years was a little tighter than she remembered, but it looked good. She had put on lipstick, a little brighter than usual, and let down her hair, which she usually wore in a severe bun. Victor, sitting on the couch with a book, looked up and smiled. "You look amazing," he said. "Is this for a corporate event?" "Yes," Sarah said, feeling a little guilty. She hadn't told him that she'd hesitated until the very end, that she'd almost stayed home, that Alex had talked her into it. "Do you mind if I go?" "Of course I don't mind." Victor closed the book and looked at her with his usual warmth. "Have fun. You work too much." Sarah nodded, but something inside her twisted. He was so right, so understanding, and somehow it only made her feel more alone. The loft was packed. The music was blaring, the lights were flashing, reflecting off the cocktail glasses. Sarah stood at the bar, clutching a glass of something sweet and strong. She was already regretting that she had come. Around her, her colleagues were laughing, dancing. Someone was trying to sing karaoke, but she felt like an outsider. Her gaze wandered over the crowd until it landed on Alex. He was in the center of the dance floor, moving effortlessly, as if the music were part of his body. He was wearing a black shirt, a few buttons undone, and jeans that fit like they were made just for him. He caught her eye and, still moving, beckoned with a finger. Sarah rolled her eyes, but her feet were already carrying her toward the dance floor, as if they had a mind of their own. "I didn't think you'd come after all," Alex said when she was next to him. His voice was loud enough to be heard over the music, but it still had that same cheeky edge. "I didn't think so myself," she said, trying not to look him in the eye. They were too close, and he smelled of the same cologne mixed with something else, whiskey, maybe, or just the heat of his skin. "Well, Miller, shall we dance?" He held out his hand to her, and there was something in his smile that made her heart beat a little faster. "I don't dance," she said, but her hand was already in his palm. "Everyone's dancing," he grinned, and a second later they were moving to the beat. The music was fast, pulsating, and Sarah felt her body begin to relax, the tension of the last few weeks dissolving in the movement. Alex was a good dancer, confident but not intrusive, guiding her without making her feel awkward. They danced, they laughed, and at some point Sarah realized that for the first time in a long time she wasn't thinking about Victor, about her life, about what she should. She was just here, in this moment, with this man who was looking at her as if she were the only one in the room. They went outside when the party was in full swing. The air was cool, smelling of asphalt and the city at night. Sarah hugged herself, wishing she had brought her jacket. Alex noticed, and without saying a word, took off his shirt, leaving him in a black t-shirt, and threw it over her shoulders. "Are you a knight now?" she joked, but her voice trembled, not from the cold, but from something else. "Just for you," he replied, a spark in his eyes. He stepped closer, and Sarah felt her heart pounding so loudly that she could hear it over the music coming from the club. "Alex, She began, but he didn't let her finish. His hand touched her cheek, warm, slightly rough, and the next second his lips covered hers. It wasn't a soft, timid kiss, it was greedy, hot, full of that same animal passion that she was afraid to even think about. Her body responded instantly. Heat spread through her veins, goosebumps covered her skin, and her mind seemed to just switch off. When they pulled away, Sarah was out of breath. She looked at him, trying to understand what had just happened. Alex wasn't smiling. His eyes were serious, almost vulnerable. "It was a mistake," she whispered, but her voice sounded unconvincing even to herself. "Maybe," he said, but his hand was still on her waist. Or maybe it was the only right thing all evening. Sarah turned away, her thoughts in a tangle. She thought of Victor, of his kind smile, of his safe arms, of him waiting for her at home. But at the same time, she felt herself being drawn to Alex, not by her mind, but by something deep, primal. It was like waking up after a long sleep, and it scared the hell out of her. "I have to go," she said, taking off his shirt and handing it to him. This can't happen again." Alex took the shirt, but his gaze did not leave her. "As you say, Miller, but you know where to find me." The next day, Sarah sat in her office, trying not to look at the marketing department. She felt like she'd committed a crime. The kiss from the night before burned on her lips like a brand, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw Alex, his cheeky smile, his dark eyes, his hands. She tried to focus on her work, but the numbers on the report were blurry, and the same question kept spinning in her head. What have I done? She told herself it was a one-time madness. Alcohol, music, atmosphere, everything mixed together and pushed her to stupidity. But when Alex came into her department to discuss a project and their eyes met, she realized it was no accident. She was drawn to him like a magnet, and this feeling was stronger than her will. "Miller, you're a little quiet today," he said, stopping at her desk. His tone was light, but there was the same sparkle in his eyes as yesterday. "Just a lot of work," she replied without looking up. "Well, if anything happens, I'm in the next room," he said, and there was something in his voice that made her heart skip a beat again. A week passed. Sarah tried to avoid Alex, but it was almost impossible. They worked in the same office, crossed paths at meetings, in the hallways, at the coffee machine. Every time he was near, she felt her body betray her. Her pulse quickened, her cheeks burned, and her thoughts became confused. She hated herself for it, but at the same time she couldn't stop it. One evening, while she was staying late at the office to finish a report, Alex walked into her office. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and Sarah felt the air in the room grow thicker. "You're avoiding me," he said, wasting no time on the preamble. "No," she lied, but her voice was too weak to sound convincing. "You're lying," he chuckled, coming closer. "And you know what? I think about it too. About that evening. About you." Sarah stood up, trying to keep her distance, but her back hit the wall. Alex stopped a step away from her, and she could feel the warmth of his body without even touching him. "It's wrong," she said, but her voice was shaking. "I'm married, Alex." "I know," he said, and there was a flicker of something in his eyes that might have been guilt or regret. "But tell me you don't feel anything, and I'll leave. Right now." Sarah opened her mouth to say just that, but the words stuck. Instead, she stepped forward and kissed him. It was as fierce, as wild as the first time, but there was something else to it now, desperation, like she was trying to prove to herself that she could stop. But she couldn't. At her next appointment with Dr. Royce, Sarah sat silently, staring at the floor. Her fingers fiddled nervously with the hem of her sweater, and a storm raged in her chest. She didn't know how to talk about what had happened, but the silence was worse. "Sarah, you seem a little tense today," Dr. Royce said, leaning back in his chair. "Is something wrong?" She took a deep breath, gathering her strength. I kissed another man. Twice. And I don't know what to do about it." Dr. Royce's expression didn't change, didn't judge, didn't look surprised. He just nodded, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. "Tell me about it," he said. "What did you feel when it happened?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying to find words. "I felt myself. For the first time in a long time, it was like I was waking up. But at the same time, I feel terrible. I'm betraying Victor, betraying our marriage, betraying everything I believed in." "What exactly are you betraying?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. "Love? Trust? Or maybe that scenario we were talking about?" Sarah looked at him, tears glistening in her eyes. "I don't know. I just know that I can't stop, and that scares me." Dr. Royce smiled, but there was no judgment in his smile. "Fear is normal, Sarah. It means you're on the threshold of something new. The question is, are you ready to cross that line?" Sarah didn't answer. She didn't know if she was ready, but she knew she couldn't go back now. The silence in Dr. Royce's office was almost tangible, like a thick fog that enveloped but did not suffocate. Sarah sat in the familiar chair, her fingers no longer fiddling with the sleeve of her sweater, but now clutching a pen, which she twisted in her hands as if trying to squeeze answers out of it. The past week had left its mark on her, like a burnt pattern on wood. Kisses with Alex, the heat of his hands, her own reflection in the mirror that she no longer recognized. She felt on the edge between who she was and who she could be. But the edge was sharp, and every step along it cut until it drew blood. Dr. Royce looked at her with his usual mixture of calm and curiosity. His eyes, as always, seemed like a window into another world, not judgmental, but demanding honesty. "You look like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, Sarah," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Want to tell me what happened?" Sarah opened her mouth, but the words stuck in her throat. She wanted to tell her everything. The way Alex looked at her as if he could see the real her, the way she felt suffocated next to Victor, the way her own life felt alien to her. But instead, she just shook her head. "I don't know how to say this," she finally admitted. "It's all too messy, too confusing." Royce nodded as if he had expected it. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the armrest, a habit Sarah had begun to notice. "Sometimes the words we can't say out loud are easier to put on paper," he said. "There's this thing called writing therapy. You write everything you think, feel, and fear, without censorship, without fear that someone will read it. It's like talking to yourself, only honest. Want to try it?" Sarah frowned. She hadn't written anything other than work reports in years. She'd kept a journal in college, but it had been naive entries about dreams and crushes. And now, her thoughts were like a dark forest, now thick, scary, full of shadows. But something about Royce's offer had caught her attention. Maybe this was a chance to finally make sense of the chaos she carried inside her. "What exactly should I write?" she asked, her voice sounding uncertain, almost childish. "That's it," he said, his smile warm but firm. "The truth. Call it a truth diary. Write about what's eating you up, what you can't tell me, or Victor, or even yourself. Write as if no one will ever read it, because no one will." Sarah nodded, although doubts still fought inside her. She was afraid to look so deeply into herself, but at the same time she felt that there was no other way. She was tired of pretending, tired of wearing a mask, tired of the silence that grew between her and Victor like a wall. At home that evening, Sarah sat on the balcony with a new notebook she had bought on the way. It was plain, with a black cover, without any patterns or writing, like a blank page of her own soul. Victor was in the living room, watching a documentary about space, and his voice, commenting on something about black holes, reached her like a muffled echo. She opened the notebook, picked up a pen, and froze. The blank page stared at her like a challenge. "A diary of truth," she wrote at the top, her handwriting shaking slightly. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, imagining that no one would ever see these words, and began to write. October 20th, 2025. "I don't know where to start. Dr. Royce said to write the truth, but the truth is like a knife. It cuts, and I'm not sure I want to see blood, but I'm going to try, because if I don't start, I think I'm going to explode. I kissed Alex twice, and each time it was like jumping off a cliff, terrifying, but so damn real. I didn't think I could feel this way. I didn't think there was anything left in me that could burn. He looks at me like I'm not just Sarah, Victor's wife, not just the sales manager, but someone different, someone I could be. And it scares me because I don't know who this woman is. But I want to know her. Victor. Victor doesn't see me. Not the real me. He sees the Sarah I've been playing for years. Calm, reliable, the one who always says, everything's fine. But I'm not fine. I'm screaming inside, and he can't even hear. Yesterday, he asked me how my day was, and I almost screamed, "What the hell day? I'm drowning, Victor, and you don't even notice." But I just smiled and said everything was fine, because that's what I do. I smile, I pretend, and I'm so tired. Sarah paused, her hand shaking. She reread what she had written, and her heart sank. It was the truth, messy, uncomfortable, but hers. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she refused to let them spill. Instead, she continued writing. "I don't know if I love Victor. I thought I did, but now I'm not sure. Love shouldn't be so empty, right? I look at him and I want to cry. Not because he's bad. He's good. Too good. But I don't want to be good. I want to feel. I want my heart to beat the way it does when Alex touches me, and I hate myself for it." I hate myself for betraying him, for not being able to stop, for wanting more. Sarah closed her notebook, her breathing heavy as if she had run a mile. She sat there, looking out at the city lights, and felt something shift inside her. It wasn't relief, but it was close, like the first breath after being underwater for so long. Over the next week, she wrote almost every night. Sometimes they were short notes, sometimes long, rambling streams of thought. The journal became her refuge, a place where she could be honest, even if that honesty tore her apart. October 23rd, 2025. Alex was in my office again today. He just came in to discuss some stupid report, but I couldn't look at him. His voice, his smell, his damn smile, it was like a drug. I told myself I wouldn't give in again, but when he left, I realized I wanted him back. What's wrong with me? I'm married, I'm supposed to be an adult, responsible, but all I can think about is his hands on my waist, his breath on my neck. I'm going crazy. Victor made dinner tonight. Lasagna, my favorite. And I sat there at the table, eating, smiling, and in my head, I was thinking, you don't know who I am. You don't know what I've done. I feel like a traitor. But at the same time, I'm mad at him. Why doesn't he notice? Why can't he see that I'm dying next to him? I want him to scream, to shake me, to ask what the hell is going on. But he just smiles and tells me he loves me, and I don't know what's worse. October 25th, 2025. I had a dream. Alex and I were somewhere by the sea. Not here, not in this gray city. Somewhere where the water was warm and the sky was so blue it hurt my eyes. He held my hand and I laughed. I don't remember the last time I laughed like that in reality. I woke up feeling like I'd stolen something that didn't belong to me. But I want to steal more. I want to steal this whole life where I'm alive, where I'm not just a shadow. Sarah wrote, and with every line she breathed easier. The journal was a mirror in which she saw herself not perfect, not right, but real. She wrote about her fears, that she would ruin her marriage, that she would lose herself, that she would never find what she so desperately sought. She wrote about Victor, not just his blindness to her pain, but also how he tried, how he loved her in his own way, how she hated herself for missing it. And she wrote about Alex, how he made her feel wanted, alive, but also how she feared that it was an illusion, a mirage that would disappear the moment she tried to touch him. At her next session with Dr. Royce, Sarah brought her journal with her. She wasn't going to show it to him, it was too personal, too raw, but she wanted to tell him how he had changed her. She sat with the notebook in her lap, like a shield. I write, she said, her voice firmer than usual. Every day, and it helps. It's like I can finally hear myself. Royce smiled, a hint of pride in his eyes. This is a big step, Sarah. What do you find in this diary? What does it give you? She thought, looking at the black cover. Freedom, she answered finally. Freedom to be honest. I write things I would never say out loud. About Victor, about Alex, about myself. And it's scary, but at the same time, liberating. I'm starting to understand what I want, or at least what I don't want. What is it you don't want? He asked, his voice soft but insistent. Sarah looked into his eyes, and for a second it seemed to her that she was standing on the edge of an abyss. I don't want to live in a cage, she said. Even if the cage is comfortable, even if it's golden, I want me, the real me, even if it means destroying everything. Royce nodded, and there was something in his silence that gave her strength. Then keep writing, he said, and keep searching. You're on the right path, Sarah, even if it seems dark to you. That night, Sarah sat on the balcony again. Victor was already asleep, and the house was as quiet as an abandoned temple. She opened her journal and began to write, feeling the words flow like a river that had been held back for too long. October 27th, 2025. I don't know what's next. I don't know if I'll stay with Victor, go to Alex, or leave everyone. But I do know one thing. I don't want to be a shadow anymore. I want to be alive. And if that means destroying everything, then maybe it's worth it. Because the truth, no matter how dirty, is better than the lie I lived in. She closed the notebook and looked up at the stars. They were distant, cold, but so bright. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like maybe she could shine too. Victor stood at the kitchen table, holding a mug of cold coffee. The morning was gray, with low clouds that seemed to weigh down the city with their weight. He looked out the window, but his gaze was empty, as if he saw not the street, but something much further away or nothing at all. He had not slept last night. His eyes, usually clear and calm, were now covered with a reddish net, and his face looked as if someone had drained all the energy from it. In his hands, he still felt the weight of the black notebook he had found in Sarah's drawer yesterday. Her truth diary. The words he had read still burned him from the inside, like hot coals. It all started by chance. Sarah had been late at work the previous evening, as she had often been in recent weeks. Victor was looking for a spare notebook to write down his shopping list, as his own had run out. He opened her desk drawer, expecting to find her usual stationery, but instead he came across a thick black notebook. It was lying under a pile of papers, as if Sarah had tried to hide it, but had not tried very hard. Curiosity pricked him. He knew Sarah sometimes wrote, but he had never seen her hide her notes so carefully. He opened the first page, and the words "Diary of Truth" made him freeze. Something told him to close the notebook and forget about it, but he could not. He sat down on the sofa and began to read. Each page was like a blow. Light at first, almost unnoticeable, but with each line stronger, deeper. Sarah wrote about her loneliness, about how she felt suffocated next to him, about how he couldn't see her, the real her. She wrote about Alex, about the kisses, about the passion, about how he made her feel alive. Victor read, and his world crumbled, word by word. He felt pain, sharp as a knife cutting into his chest. Then came anger, furious, almost blinding, the desire to burst into Sarah's office, find Alex, and smash his face in. And then humiliation, cold and sticky, as if he were paraded naked in front of a crowd. Victor, the man who loved her, who did everything to make her happy, was found to be insufficient, invisible, blind. He read to the last page late at night, when the silence in the house was so thick it seemed he could cut it. He closed the notebook and sat in the darkness for a long time, looking at its even lines, which now seemed like a betrayal to him. He waited for himself to explode, to scream, to wake Sarah, to throw her own words in her face. But instead, he carefully put the notebook back in the drawer, turned off the light, and went to bed, trying not to wake her. His heart was pounding, but he was silent. He didn't know why. Maybe because he was afraid to hear the truth out loud. Maybe because he didn't know what to say. Or maybe because somewhere deep inside, he felt that he was guilty too. The morning dragged on, like an old movie no one wanted to watch. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her usual smile on her face, which now seemed foreign to Victor. She poured herself a cup of coffee, threw in a spoonful of sugar, and looked at him. "You're a little quiet today," she said, stirring her coffee. Her voice was light, almost playful, but there was a wariness to it, as if she suspected something. Victor squeezed his mug a little harder than he needed to. He wanted to say, "I know about Alex. I know what you think about me. I know you're unhappy." But instead he shrugged and said, "I just didn't get enough sleep. Lots of work." Sarah nodded, her gaze flickering over him, but she didn't say anything. She sat down at the table, opened her phone, and started scrolling through something news, social media, who knows. Victor looked at her and felt two desires fighting inside him, to scream and to hug her. He wanted to ask why she hadn't told him, why she had let it go so far, why she hadn't given him a chance to fix it. But he remained silent. His silence was like a wall he was building between them, and he hated himself for it, but he didn't know how to stop. The day passed in a strange tension. Victor went to work, but his mind was everywhere, but in the code he was supposed to be writing. He sat in his office, staring at the screen with the blinking cursor, and thought about Sarah, about how she looked when they first met, her laugh, her eyes that sparkled when she told him about her dreams. He remembered their first trip together, to the lake where they swam under the stars, and she whispered that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. Where did all that go? When did he become blind to her? He opened his laptop and began writing a letter. not to Sarah, but to himself, trying to process what he was feeling. He wrote about his pain, how the words in her journal had hurt him, how he felt betrayed but also guilty. He wrote about how he was afraid of losing her, but even more afraid that she was already gone, even if she was still sitting at their kitchen table. He didn't send the letter. He just saved it as a draft and closed his laptop. That evening, he got home before Sarah. She was still at work, or maybe with Alex, he thought, and the thought was like a punch to the gut. He paced the apartment like a caged animal, unsure what to do with himself. He wanted to talk to her, but every time he imagined the conversation, his throat tightened. What would he say? I read your diary. I know about you and Alex. Why don't you love me? Every sentence sounded pathetic, and he hated himself for it. Instead, he took a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, poured himself half a glass, and sat on the balcony. The alcohol burned his throat, but it didn't dull the pain. He looked out at the city, at the flashing lights, and thought how strange it was that life went on around him while his own was crumbling. He didn't know how long he sat there, but when he heard the front door open, his heart sank. Victor, Sarah called, her voice tired but soft. Are you home? On the balcony, he answered, trying to keep his voice even. She came out to him, holding a bag in her hands. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and there was a slight blush on her cheeks from the cold or from something else. Victor did not want to think. She looked at the glass in his hand and frowned. Whiskey? On a weekday? She tried to joke, but her smile was strained. Sometimes it's necessary, he answered, and his voice was colder than he intended. Sarah sat down next to him, wrapping her arms around herself. She was silent, looking out at the city lights, and Victor felt the silence growing between them, not the kind that comforted, but the kind that suffocated. He wanted to say something, but the words in her diary still echoed in his head. He doesn't see me. He doesn't know who I am. And he suddenly realized that maybe she was right. Maybe he really hadn't seen her, hadn't noticed how she was fading, how her smile was becoming more and more forced, how her eyes were losing the sparkle he once loved. Sarah, he began, his voice shaking. She turned to him, and there was something in her eyes he couldn't read: fear, hope, weariness. Are you happy? She froze, her fingers tightening on the sleeve of her jacket. The question caught her off guard, and for a second she looked like she wanted to run. But then she took a deep breath and answered, I don't know, Victor. And you? He looked at her, and in that moment he wanted to tell her everything about the diary, about his pain, about how afraid he was of losing her. But instead he said, I don't know either. They sat in silence, looking out over the city, and the silence between them was louder than any words. Victor felt something crumbling, not their marriage, not their love, but something bigger, something he couldn't name, and he knew it might be too late to save it. The next day, Victor went to work, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about Sarah, about her diary, about the way she described Alex. He hated this man he didn't even know, but at the same time, he envied him. Envious of the way he made Sarah feel alive, the way she told him he could see the real her. Victor wondered why he couldn't do that himself. Why hadn't he noticed she was slipping away? Why had he allowed their lives to become so predictable? He decided he wouldn't tell her about the diary. Not now. Not because he was afraid of a scandal, but because he didn't know how to start the conversation. He felt like he was standing on the edge of an abyss, and one wrong move and everything would collapse. Instead, he began to watch her, to notice the way she looked away when he asked about her day, the way her smile seemed forced, the way she stayed late at work more and more often. He saw her pain, her loneliness, and it killed him because he didn't know how to save her. Sarah, unaware that Victor knew her secret, continued writing in her diary. She didn't know that her words, which she thought were so private, so hidden, had already been read. She wrote about her doubts, about how she was afraid of ruining everything, but even more afraid of staying in this life where she didn't feel like herself. She wrote about Alex, about how he made her heart beat faster, but also about how she wasn't sure if she wanted to be with him, or just what he gave her: a sense of freedom, a sense of life. October 30th, 2025. I look at Victor and I want to cry. Not because I hate him, but because I see how hard he tries. He makes me dinner, he asks how my day was, he tries to be the man I once loved him. But I can't go back. I can't pretend that everything is like before. I want to tell him the truth, but I'm afraid. Afraid that he'll hate me. Afraid that he'll leave. But most of all, I'm afraid that he'll stay, and we'll live this lie for the rest of our lives. Sarah closed the diary and hid it in a drawer, not knowing that it was no longer a secret. She lay down in bed next to Victor, who was pretending to be asleep, and closed her eyes. They lay next to each other, but there was a chasm between them, and neither of them knew how to bridge it. The rain pounded the windows of the coffee shop, fine and persistent, turning the street into a blurry watercolor. Victor sat at a corner table, away from the entrance where no one could accidentally overhear their conversation. His fingers nervously fiddled with the edge of a paper napkin, tearing it into tiny pieces. He had been here for half an hour, having come earlier than the appointed time to collect his thoughts, but as luck would have it, his thoughts were scattering like cockroaches from the light. The words from Sarah's diary were still ringing in his head, her confessions, her pain, her words about Alex. He had not slept for 2 nights, and there were dark shadows under his eyes that made his face look older than he would like. Finding Alex was easier than he expected. Social media is a funny thing. A few clicks, a few mutual friends from Sarah's office, and he's looking at the profile of the man who, without realizing it, had become his personal nightmare. The photo of Alex laughing, his bangs unkempt, surrounded by friends at some festival sent a flash of anger through Victor, but he suppressed it. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want to scream. He wanted to understand. So he wrote a message, short, dry, but with a hint of determination. We need to talk. Like men. Coffee shop on the corner of Lincoln and 5th, tomorrow at 7 p.m. An hour later, the reply came, "Okay, I'll be there." No questions, no unnecessary words. Victor hadn't known what to expect, but now, sitting in the coffee shop, he felt his heart pounding, as if about to jump into cold water. The door rang and Alex walked into the coffee shop. Victor recognized him immediately, not just from the photo, but from the confident gait that Sarah had described in her diary. Alex was wearing a dark jacket, wet from the rain, and jeans that looked like he had thrown on the first thing that came to hand. His gaze quickly ran around the room, stopped at Victor, and for a second there was a flicker of wariness in his eyes. He was clearly expecting something else, maybe fists, not a conversation over coffee. Victor gestured to the chair opposite, and Alex, after a slight hesitation, walked over and sat down. "Victor, right?" he said, his voice calm but slightly hoarse, as if he hadn't slept as badly as his interlocutor. "Yes," Victor replied, his tone even, although inside he was seething. He pushed aside the napkin he had managed to turn into a pile of shreds and folded his hands on the table. "Thank you for coming." Alex nodded, his gaze attentive, assessing. He was clearly trying to figure out what this was all about. "I take it this isn't just a friendly get-together," he said, leaning back in his chair. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were tense. "What do you want?" Victor took a deep breath. He had rehearsed this moment in his head dozens of times, but now that Alex was sitting in front of him, the words felt wrong, too heavy, or, conversely, too light. He could scream, accuse, attack with his fists, but that wasn't what he wanted. That wasn't why he was here. He looked at Alex, at his unkempt bangs, at the tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, at his confident, almost insolent smile, and tried to see what Sarah saw. What made her write the words in his diary that broke his heart. "I know about you and Sarah," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "I know you're close. I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to fight. I just want to understand." Alex tensed, his eyebrows raised slightly. He clearly hadn't expected this to begin. "Understand?" he asked again, and a mixture of surprise and wariness flashed in his voice. "What exactly?" Victor clenched his fists under the table, but his face remained calm. He felt anger and pain fighting inside him, but he kept them in check. "I read her diary," he said, and his words fell into the silence like stones into water. I know how she feels about you. I know how you make her feel alive, and I want to know what you gave her that I couldn't. Alex froze. His eyes widened, and for a second he looked as if he'd been struck. He clearly wasn't prepared for this question. Not the accusations, not the threats, but the honesty, the vulnerability, the pain that was evident in every word Victor said. He ran a hand through his hair, buying time, and looked away, watching the rain outside the window. Shit, he muttered finally. Are you serious? It couldn't be more serious, Victor replied, his voice shaking, but he didn't look away. I don't know what's happening to her, to us, but I know she's unhappy with me, and I want to understand why. What did I miss? What did you do that I couldn't? Alex looked at him, and there was something new in his eyes, not insolence, not mockery, but something like respect. Or maybe pity. He cleared his throat, trying to find the words. Look, I didn't plan any of this, he began, his voice quieter than usual. It just happened. Sarah, she seemed lost. She told me that herself. Not about you, not about your marriage, but about herself. She said she didn't know who she was. And I was just there. I listened to her. I saw the way she lit up when she talked about the things that mattered to her. About her dreams, about the books she wanted to write, about the places she wanted to go. I didn't do anything special, Victor. I just saw her. Victor felt his throat tighten. Alex's words were like a mirror in which he saw his own failure. He remembered how Sarah had tried to talk to him about her feelings, about her longing, but he had always brushed her off, diverted the conversation to something safe, to work, to plans, to everyday life. He had thought that this was normal, that this was how it should be. But now he realized that every time he brushed her off, he was losing her. Little by little, piece by piece. You think I don't see her? He asked, his voice hoarse, almost breaking. I love her. I've always loved her. I thought I was doing everything right. I tried to be reliable, to be someone she could lean on. But, he paused, feeling tears welling up in his eyes, and clenched his jaw to keep them from spilling. But it seemed like it wasn't enough. Alex looked at him, and his face softened. He no longer looked like a rival, like an enemy. He looked like a man who had found himself in a situation 26F14D2E8B5A2F1C7E8C3F7B9C2E, title equals sign, chapter 5 underscore first contact. MD content type equals text markdown. The same trap as Sarah, between what he felt and what he wanted to feel. He didn't know how to answer Victor's question. He didn't know how to explain that he hadn't given Sarah anything special, that he had simply been the one who listened to her, who hadn't demanded that she be correct, good, or convenient. He didn't want to hurt this man who sat before him, clenching his fists as if he were holding on to the last thread of self-control. But he couldn't lie. I don't know what to tell you, he said finally, his voice soft, almost guilty. I didn't want to interfere with your life. I didn't know she was married when it all started. And then it was too late. I'm not a hero, Victor. I'm no better than you. It's just, that's how it happened. Victor nodded, though every word Alex said was like salt in a wound. He didn't want to hear that Alex wasn't to blame, that he hadn't planned to ruin their marriage. He wanted to hate him, but looking at him, he knew that hatred wouldn't help. It wouldn't bring Sarah back, it wouldn't fix what he'd missed. He stood up. His movements were sharp, but not aggressive. Thank you for your honesty, he said, his voice cold but not angry. I don't know what's next, but I don't want to lose her. Alex nodded, his gaze hard, but he said nothing. Victor threw a few bills on the table for his coffee and walked out into the rain without looking back. He felt the water running down his face, mixing with the tears he could no longer hold back. He didn't know what to do next, but he knew that this conversation was just the beginning. The beginning of something that could either save him and Sarah or destroy everything completely. The rain had been falling steadily for 3 days now, turning the city into a gray, glistening picture of moisture, where every step echoed like the splash of boots through puddles. Victor sat in the same coffee shop where he and Alex had met for the first time, at the same corner table, but now his fingers were no longer fiddling with his napkin, but clutching the edge of the wooden table, as if trying to hold on to something solid in this shaky world. He was waiting for Alex. This was their third meeting in a week, and each of them was like a step on thin ice, tense, uncomfortable, but somehow necessary. After that first conversation, Victor had no plans to continue. He had his answer, or at least part of it. Alex wasn't the villain, the scheming seducer he'd imagined. He was simply a man in the right place at the right time to fill a void Victor hadn't seen in his wife. But something about that conversation had caught his attention. Maybe it was Alex's honesty, his vulnerability, so different from the cocky mask he wore. Or maybe it was the realization that they were both part of the same story, with Sarah playing the lead and them just supporting players. Alex walked into the coffee shop, shaking water off his jacket. His face was grim, without the usual mocking smile that had so irritated Victor the first time they met. He looked tired, as if the rain had washed away all his usual shine. He sat down across from him, ordered an espresso, and looked at Victor, his gaze direct but not hostile. "You again," he said, a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "I thought we had it all figured out." Victor shrugged, his fingers still gripping the edge of the table. "I thought so too. But I think we both know it's not just us. It's about Sarah and what she does to us." Alex narrowed his eyes, his fingers hovering over the small coffee cup. "Does?" he asked, his tone sharper than he probably intended. "You make it sound like she's some kind of puppeteer and we're the puppets." "Isn't that so?" Victor leaned forward, his voice quiet but steely. "Have you read her diary?" "No, of course not. But I have. And do you know what I saw there? Not just her feelings, not just her pain. I saw her playing with us. With you to feel alive. With me to keep her comfortable. She writes about you as if you were some kind of salvation, but at the same time, she doesn't leave me. She keeps us both on a leash, and I want to know why." Alex leaned back in his chair, his face tense. He clearly hadn't expected this to happen. His fingers tapped the rim of his cup, and he looked away, watching the rain outside the window. "Are you serious?" he said finally, his voice quieter than before. "You think she's manipulating us?" "Do you think not?" Victor retorted. "Think about it, Alex. Did she promise you anything? Did she say she would leave for me? That she wanted to be with you? Or is she just taking what she needs and leaving you guessing?" Alex was silent, and that silence spoke louder than any words. Victor saw his face change from skepticism to doubt, from doubt to something that looked like anger slowly simmering. He ran a hand through his hair, his usual confidence beginning to crack at the seams. "Shit," he muttered. I thought it was just chemistry, something real. She told me she felt alive with me, that I saw the real her. But," he trailed off, his gaze hardening, "she never said she wanted to be with me. Not once. I thought it was because she was confused, but maybe you're right. Maybe she's just using me." Victor nodded, feeling his own anger mingle with something else, pity, not for himself, but for Alex. He saw this man he had hated a week ago beginning to understand that he, like Victor, was just a pawn in a game Sarah was playing, perhaps without even fully realizing it. "I'm not saying she's doing this on purpose," Victor said, his voice softening. "Maybe she doesn't realize what she's doing, but she's playing with both of us, and I'm tired of being a part of it." Alex finished his coffee in one gulp, his movements sharp, almost angry. "You know, I'm mad at myself," he said, looking Victor in the eye. "I thought I was smarter. I thought I could see right through people. And she just took me for a ride. I was, what? An escape from boredom? A way to feel wanted? Shit, I feel like an idiot." Victor smiled sadly. "Welcome to the club. I thought I knew her too. I thought I was doing everything right. And then I read her diary and realized that I was just a foil to her. Convenient, reliable, but not what she needed. And I'm mad at myself for not seeing it sooner, for letting it go this far." They sat in silence, looking at each other, And there was something strange in that silence, not hostility, not rivalry, but something like understanding. Two people who had loved the same woman, but now saw her from a different side. Two people who felt betrayed, but didn't want to just give up and walk away. "So what now?" Alex asked, his voice hoarse but determined. "Do we just sit here and feel sorry for ourselves? Or what?" Victor shrugged, but his eyes were firm. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I don't want to make a scene. I don't want to yell at her. But I want her to see the truth. Her truth. So she can see that she can't just play with us like toys and pretend everything is okay." Alex nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Agreed. But how? We can't just shove her diary under her nose and say, 'Hey, we know everything.' That's too easy. And honestly, I don't want to be the one to put her down. I just want her to be honest. With herself. With us." Victor thought about it. He remembered Sarah writing in her diary about her loneliness, her longing, her struggle with herself. She wasn't a villain. She wasn't a cold manipulator. She was lost. She was confused. And maybe her actions were an attempt to find herself, even if that attempt hurt them all. But that didn't excuse her. It didn't excuse the lies she told not just to them, but to herself. "Maybe we don't have to force her," Victor said finally. "Maybe we just have to show her what we see, what we know, and give her a choice." Alex narrowed his eyes, his brows furrowing. "Choice? Which one?" "The choice to be honest," Victor answered. "To say what she wants, not to play, not to hide behind your truth diaries, but to say it out loud. To me, to you, to herself. If she wants to be with you, let her say it. If she wants to leave, let her leave. But I don't want to be part of her game anymore." Alex nodded, his face softening. "Okay, but how do we do that? Just sit down with her at the table and say, 'Sarah, choose.'" Victor shook his head. "No, it has to be subtler. She has to understand that we know, without us blaming her. Maybe we should talk to her together. Not as enemies, not as rivals, but as two people who are tired of being lied to." Alex chuckled, but there was no malice in his laughter. "Are you serious? You and I, two idiots who fell in love with the same woman, are going to sit down with her and have what? Family therapy?" "Why not?" Victor replied, his voice firm. "We both know what's going on. We both feel used, and we both want this to end. Not with a fight, not with a scandal, but with the truth." Alex looked at him, and a spark flashed in his eyes, not the insolent one like before, but something different, something like respect. "Okay," he said finally, "I'm in. But damn, this is going to be the weirdest conversation of my life." Their second meeting was 2 days later, in a pub on the outskirts of town. It was loud, smelled of beer and roasting meat, and no one paid attention to the two men sitting in the corner with bottles of dark ale. Victor had chosen the place because it was far from his and Sarah's home, far from the office where Alex worked. It was a neutral space where they could talk without fear of being overheard. This time, the conversation began more easily. Alex was no longer being sarcastic, no longer trying to hide his irritation behind mockery. He was frank, and this surprised Victor. "I was thinking about what you said," Alex began, taking a sip of beer. "About manipulation. And you know, I'm starting to see it. She never promised me anything serious. Never said she'd leave you. But she always sort of had me on the hook, telling me how good I was, how I made her feel alive, but then she'd come back to you. And like a fool, I thought it was because she was confused. And now I'm wondering, maybe she just wanted me to be her adventure." Victor nodded, feeling his own pain respond to Alex's words. "She wrote in her diary that you made her feel free," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But she also wrote that she was afraid of ruining everything, afraid of losing what we had. I thought it was about love, about our marriage. But now I see it's about safety. She wants you to feel alive, and she wants me to feel safe. And that's not fair. Not to you, and not to me." Alex shook his head, his fingers tightening around the bottle. "Damn, I'm mad at myself," he said. I've always considered myself the type to not let myself be used. And then, I just got into trouble. She looked at me with those big eyes, said a few words about how bad she felt, and I was ready to run to the ends of the earth after her. Like a teenager. Victor smiled sadly. I'm mad at myself, too, for not seeing her drift away, for thinking everything was fine when she was screaming for help and I couldn't hear her. I was so busy being a good husband that I forgot to ask her what she wanted. And now I'm sitting here with you, trying to figure out how to fix it. They fell silent, looking at their bottles. The noise of the pub laughter, clinking glasses, muted music seemed distant, as if they were in some bubble where only they and their shared pain existed. Victor suddenly realized that he didn't hate Alex. He couldn't. This man sitting across from him was as lost, as wounded as he was. You know what's weirdest? Alex said, breaking the silence. I saw in her what I was missing. She was, like fire, bright, unpredictable, alive. I was tired of my life parties, casual relationships, a job I was bored with. And she was something real. Or so I thought. Victor nodded, his gaze fixed on the bottle, but he listened to every word. And I saw her as a home, he said quietly, a place where I could be myself, where I could be at peace. I thought that was enough, that if I was reliable, if I did everything right, she would be happy. But I was wrong. She needed more. She needed someone who would see her fire and not just keep her safe. Alex looked at him, and a shadow of surprise flashed in his eyes. Damn, you sound like a poet, he said, his voice light but not mocking. But, I think we both saw in her what we were missing. I wanted her fire, you wanted her warmth, and she didn't seem to know what she wanted. Victor nodded, feeling his throat tighten. And that's why we're here, he said. Two idiots who loved the same woman and are now trying to figure out how to stop her from destroying us completely. Alex laughed, and this time his laugh was genuine. I'm starting to like you, Victor. Although, damn, I never thought I'd be sitting in a bar with the husband of the woman I'm with. Well, Victor smiled sadly. Yeah, I understand. And I didn't think I'd be sitting here with you either. But maybe it's not so bad. Maybe we can do something. Together. Alex raised an eyebrow, his gaze becoming more serious. Are you still talking about that conversation? About making her see the truth? Yes, Victor said, but not revenge, not humiliation. I want her to look at herself, at us, to understand that she can't just keep us both as backup options. She has to choose, or at least be honest. Alex nodded, his fingers tapping the bottle. Okay, but how? I don't want to put on a show. I don't want her to feel cornered, but I want her to stop playing. Victor thought about it. He remembered Sarah writing in her diary about her fear of ruining everything, fear of losing what she had. He knew she wasn't mean or cruel. She was just confused. But her confusion had hurt them all, and it had to end. I think we need to meet her together, he said finally. Not to blame, but to talk, so she can hear us, both of us, so she can understand that we know, and that we won't play by her rules anymore. Alex nodded, his face serious. It'll be weird, but I'm in. Just one condition. We do it honestly. No shouting, no accusations, just the truth. I agree, Victor said, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something right. Not for Sarah, not for himself, but for the truth that could perhaps set them all free. Their third meeting was scheduled for a few days later, but this time it wasn't in a coffee shop or a pub. They chose a small park on the outskirts of town, where the rain had finally stopped, leaving behind damp air and the smell of wet grass. They sat on a bench, looking out over a pond where ducks swam lazily, oblivious to the two men discussing how to change their lives. I was thinking about what you said, Alex began, his voice quieter than usual, about what we saw in her, and I realized that maybe I didn't know her that well. I saw the Sarah I wanted to see, the one who laughs, who dances, who looks at me like I'm the center of her world. But maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was just My imagination. Victor nodded, his gaze fixed on the water. I don't know her either, he admitted. I thought I did. I thought she was my Sarah, my wife, my home. But now I see that I only knew the part of her she showed me. And the real Sarah, she's out there somewhere, in her diary, in her thoughts, in her kisses with you. And I don't know how to get through to her. Alex looked at him, and there was something new in his eyes, not just respect, but something like sympathy. We're both in trouble, aren't we? He said, and his voice was almost sad. Falling in love with a woman who may not exist. Victor nodded, feeling his throat tighten. Maybe so, but I don't want to give in. I don't want to just walk away. I want her to see us, to see that we're not just her husband and her lover. We're people, and we deserve the truth. Alex nodded, his face serious. Then let's do it. Let's meet her, together, and see what she says when she realizes that we know. They agreed to meet Sarah. Not in a coffee shop, not in a pub, but somewhere neutral, the same park where they were sitting now. They decided they wouldn't accuse, they wouldn't shout. They would just tell her they knew, that they'd seen her diary, that they'd talked to each other. They would give her a chance to be honest with them, with herself, and whatever she chose, they would accept it. But they would no longer be her puppets. As they stood up from the bench, the rain began to drizzle again, but neither of them paid it any mind. They walked side by side, two people who had recently been enemies and now had become strange allies. They didn't know what this meeting would bring, but they knew one thing: they were tired of lies, and they were ready for the truth, whatever it might be. The autumn park was quiet, despite it being a Saturday morning. Leaves, crimson and gold, lined the paths, and the air smelled damp and smoked from a distant fire. Victor had chosen this place deliberately neutral, open, where no one would feel cornered. He sat on a bench by the pond, looking at his reflection in the murky water. In his hands was a black notebook, Sarah's diary, which he had not opened since the night he first read it. But today he had not brought it for himself. Today he wanted the truth to be heard out loud. The idea of a triple date was born during the last conversation with Alex. They were both tired of the unspoken, of the feeling that Sarah was holding them by invisible threads, playing with their feelings, perhaps without even realizing it. Victor suggested inviting her to the park under the pretext of a friendly meeting, so as not to scare her off right away. Alex agreed, although he skeptically noted that it would be damn awkward. But they both knew there was no other way. It was time to put an end to this game. Sarah was the first to arrive. She appeared on the path, her dark coat flapping in the wind, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail. Her face was tense, though she tried to look casual. Victor saw her gaze flicker to his hands, where the journal lay, and a flicker of worry flickered in her eyes. "Victor," she said, coming closer. Her voice was light, but there was a sense of caution in it. "You said it was just a meeting. What kind of theatricality is this?" She nodded at the notebook, trying to smile, but it came out forced. "Sit down," he said, gesturing toward the bench. His voice was calm, but there was a firmness to it that Sarah hadn't noticed before. "This isn't theatrics. This is important." She frowned but sat up, holding her bag in her lap like a shield. "What's going on? You're scaring me." Before Victor could respond, Alex appeared on the path. He was wearing his usual leather jacket, but his usual cheeky smile was missing. His gaze was serious, almost heavy, and when he looked at Sarah, a mixture of pain and determination flashed in his eyes. Sarah froze, her face pale, as if she had just realized that she was trapped. "Alex?" Her voice broke. She looked at Victor, then back at Alex. "What is he doing here? Victor, what kind of circus is this?" "This isn't a circus," Victor said, his voice even but firm. "We want to talk, all three of us, like adults." Sarah laughed, but it was a nervous, almost hysterical laugh. "Talk? About what? Are you best friends now? Is this some kind of stupid prank?" Alex sat down at the other end of the bench, leaving Sarah between himself and Victor. He looked at her, and his voice, usually light and mocking, was unexpectedly serious. "This is not a prank, Sarah. We know, About everything. About your feelings, about your thoughts, about us. Sarah froze, her fingers gripping the strap of her bag, so tightly her knuckles turned white. What do you mean? We know. Her voice was quiet, but there was panic in it. Victor, what did you tell him? Victor looked into her eyes, and there was no anger in his gaze, only weariness and determination. He slowly picked up the diary, holding it so that she could see the cover. I didn't tell him. I showed him this. Your truth diary. Sarah gasped, her eyes widening, and she instinctively reached for the notebook, but Victor pulled her hand away. You read it. Her voice was shaking, anger and fear mixed in it. It's mine. It's personal. How dare you? I dared because you left me no choice, Victor said, his voice calm but hurt. You wrote about us, about your life, about how you were suffocating, how lonely you felt. But you didn't say a word to me. You went to him, he nodded at Alex, and you played with both of us. I want to understand why. Sarah opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck. She looked to Alex for support, but he just shook his head. He's right, Sarah, Alex said, his voice quieter than usual. I thought we had something real. But then Victor showed me your journal, and I realized you were using me. I don't know if it was on purpose or not, but you kept me on the hook to feel alive, and then you came back to him like nothing had happened. It's not like that, Sarah jumped up, her voice sharp, almost screaming. You don't understand anything. This isn't a game. I wasn't manipulating you. I'm confused. I don't know what I want. Victor looked at her, and in his eyes there was not anger, but something much worse, disappointment. Then let's figure it out, he said, opening the diary. Let's listen to what you wrote. Maybe it will help you understand. He opened the notebook to a random page and began to read aloud, his voice even but each word like a blow. October 20th, 2025. I kissed Alex. Twice. And each time it was like jumping off a cliff, terrifying, but so damn real. I didn't think I could feel this way. He looks at me like I'm not just Sarah, Victor's wife, but someone else. Someone I could be. Sarah turned pale and her hands began to tremble. Stop, she whispered, but Victor didn't stop. Victor, he doesn't see me. Not the real me. He sees the Sarah I've been playing for years. Calm, reliable, the one who always says everything's fine. But I'm not normal. I'm screaming inside, and he doesn't even hear. Sarah covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. Enough, she said louder, but her voice was breaking. Please, enough. Alex, who had been silent until then, leaned forward. No, Sarah, that's not enough, he said, his voice firm but not cruel. You wrote that I made you feel free, but you never said you wanted to be with me. You just took what you needed and left, and like a fool, I thought that meant something. Remember that night at the loft? You said it was a mistake, but a week later you kissed me again, and I believed it was real. But now I see that it was just you running away. Sarah dropped her hands. Her eyes were red, but she wasn't crying. She looked at them, and there was something new in her gaze, not anger, not fear, but something like despair. You think I wanted to hurt you, she said, her voice shaking but strong. You think I sat there and planned how to use you? I don't know what I want. I don't know who I am. I was just trying to find myself. And yeah, I made mistakes. I did everything wrong, but I didn't want to hurt you. Victor closed the diary, but did not take his eyes off her. Then why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice quiet but full of pain. Why didn't you tell me you were hurt, that you were alone? I thought I was doing everything right. I thought you were happy, and you wrote that I didn't see you. But you didn't see me either, Sarah. You didn't give me a chance. Alex nodded, his face serious. You never promised me anything either, he said. You told me how good you were with me, but you never said what that meant. I thought you were confused, but now I see that you were just taking what you needed. And I don't know if it was on purpose, but it wasn't fair. Sarah was silent. For the first time, she didn't try to argue, didn't try to discount their words. She sat there, looking out at the pond, her face blank, as if she'd just seen herself from the outside. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. She just sat there, her hands limp in her lap, her eyes lost. Victor looked at her, and his heart sank. He didn't want to hurt her, didn't want to see her like this broken, lost. But he knew this conversation was necessary. For her, for him, for Alex. Sarah, he said quietly, we don't want to punish you. We don't want revenge. We just want you to be honest. With us. With yourself. You can't go on like nothing's happening. You have to choose. Not us, not him or me, but yourself. Who are you? What do you want? Sarah looked at him, and there was a spark in her eyes, not anger, not fear, but something like awakening. She looked at Alex, then back at Victor, and her lips twitched. I don't know, she whispered. I thought I knew. I thought I was writing the truth in that damn diary. But now I'm not sure. I don't know who I am, and I don't know how to fix it. Alex sighed, his shoulders slumping. Then start with this, he said. Start with what you don't know, but stop hiding. Stop playing. We deserve the truth, and so do you. Sarah was silent, her gaze fixed on the water, but she didn't try to argue anymore. She just sat there, and the silence between them was heavy, but there was something new in it, not blame, not pain, but possibility. The possibility of starting over, even if it meant destroying everything that had come before. Victor placed the diary on the bench between them. It's yours, he said, but I hope you won't hide your truth any longer. Not from us, and not from yourself. Sarah looked at the notebook, but didn't take it. She just nodded, her eyes wet but not crying. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say, and that silence was more honest than any words. The silence in their apartment was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. Victor stood by the living room window, looking out at the gray city, shrouded in the evening gloom. His hands were in his pockets, and his shoulders were slightly slumped, but there was no hesitation in his posture. He had made his decision, and now, as Sarah sat on the couch, looking at him with a mixture of bewilderment and fear, he knew there was no turning back. On the table in front of her lay an envelope, plain and white, with her name written in his neat handwriting. Inside were the divorce papers he had prepared that morning. Sarah stared at the envelope, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweater, but she didn't dare open it. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, like a child who had just realized the game was over. She opened her mouth to speak, but Victor beat her to it. I've filed for divorce, Sarah, he said, and his voice was calm, almost soft, but there was a steely determination in it. Everything we have, the apartment, the car, the savings is yours. I don't want to divide anything. I don't want to fight, but there is one thing I'm taking with me. Sarah blinked, her lips trembling. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Victor turned to face her, his gaze direct but not cruel. Your illusion, he said, the illusion that you were honest. With yourself, with me, with Alex. You wrote in your journal about the truth, but you were never honest with us. You played, Sarah. You played with both of us, and I don't want to be a part of that game anymore. Sarah gasped, her hands clenched into fists. It's not true, she said, her voice shaking with anger and despair. I wasn't playing. I was trying to understand myself. I was trying to be honest, but I got confused. Victor shook his head, his face tired but determined. Confused? Maybe. But you weren't just confused, Sarah. You kept us both on a leash. You wanted the freedom of Alex, but you didn't want to lose the safety of me. You wrote about how lonely you were, how I couldn't see you, but you never gave me a chance. You chose to lie instead of talk, and I'm tired of pretending that's okay. Sarah jumped up from the sofa, her eyes shining with tears, but she was not crying. You can't just leave, she screamed. You can't just throw away everything we had. I loved you, Victor. I still. Loved me, he interrupted, his voice sharpening, though he still held himself in check. You wrote in your diary that you didn't know if you loved me. You wrote that you felt suffocated around me. You kissed another man, Sarah, and you never told me the truth. That's not love. That's fear. Fear of being alone, fear of making a choice. And I don't want to be a part of that fear anymore. Sarah froze, her hands dropped, and she looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time. Her lips trembled, but she could not find the words. Victor took the jacket from the hanger, his movements calm, almost mechanical. I'm going away for a few days, he said. The documents are on the table. Read them, think about them. I don't want war, Sarah. I just want us both to be free. He walked out without looking back, and the door closed behind him with a soft click. Sarah was left alone, standing in the middle of the living room, her eyes glued to the envelope. She felt her world crumbling, but she couldn't move. Everything she had carefully constructed, her masks, her excuses, her illusions, was crumbling like a house of cards. The next day, Sarah came to work feeling like she'd been run over by a truck. Her eyes were red from a sleepless night, and her conversation with Victor was spinning in her head. She tried to focus on the report, but the numbers on the screen were blurry, and her thoughts kept returning to the envelope she hadn't brought herself to open. She didn't know how to move on, didn't know how to look her coworkers in the eye, didn't know how to cope with the feeling that she'd lost everything. But the worst was waiting for her at lunchtime. She was sitting in the cafeteria when Alex approached her table. His face was frowning, without the usual sparkle that once made her heart beat faster. He didn't sit down, just stood there, looking down at her, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jeans. We need to talk, he said, his voice cold, almost alien. Sarah felt her stomach clench. Alex, please, not now, she said, trying to sound calm, but her voice was shaking. I've had a hard day. Me too, he snapped, his gaze hard. But it can't wait. I told everyone. About us. About what happened at the loft. About everything. Sarah froze, her breathing stopped. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. You told? Who? Why? Alex shrugged, but there was none of his usual casualness in his movement. To my colleagues, to marketing, to sales, to everyone in the cafeteria. I'm tired, Sarah. Tired of being your secret, your escape. You used me to feel alive, and then pretended it never happened. I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I want everyone to know. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. She glanced around, and it seemed to her that the gazes of her colleagues at the tables next to her had become sharper, more curious. Her cheeks burned, and a sense of humiliation grew in her chest, as if she had been stripped naked in front of a crowd. You had no right, she said, her voice shaking with anger and pain. It was personal, it was between us. Personal? Alex leaned closer, his voice quieter but furious. You wrote in your diary about how I made you feel free, but you never told me what you really wanted. You had me on the hook, Sarah. And Victor, too. We talked, and you know what? We were both tired of being your playthings. Sarah gasped, her eyes filling with tears, but she clenched her jaw to keep them from spilling. You don't understand, she said, her voice hoarse. I didn't mean to hurt you. I didn't know how to be myself. I was trying to find myself. Alex shook his head, his gaze softening but still holding pain. Maybe so. But you found yourself at our expense, and I don't want to be a part of that anymore. Goodbye, Sarah. He turned and walked away, leaving her sitting at her desk, feeling the gazes of her colleagues burn her skin. She heard whispers, saw people look away when she looked at them. Her world, which she had worked so hard to build, was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That night, Sarah sat on the balcony, clutching her journal. She hadn't opened it since the encounter in the park, but now that it was all out in the open, she felt she had to look at her words again. She flipped through the pages, her eyes running over the lines that had once seemed so honest, so liberating. But now they seemed different, like evidence of her lies, her weakness, her inability to choose. She remembered Victor's words, "You played with both of us." She remembered Alex's look, full of pain and disappointment. She thought her diary was the truth, but now she saw that it was only part of the truth, the part she allowed herself to see. She wrote about her loneliness, her longing, but never about how her actions hurt others. She wanted freedom, but she didn't want to pay the price for it. Sarah closed her journal and looked up at the stars. They were as distant as the dreams she had once written in this same notebook. She felt humiliated, exposed, but also, for the first time in a long time, free. Not the freedom she had dreamed of while dancing with Alex, but a different kind of freedom, painful but honest. She had lost Victor, she had lost Alex, she had lost her illusion of herself. But maybe that was all she needed to start over. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she could forgive herself, if she could find her true self. But she knew one thing: checkmate. The game was over, and now she would have to live with the consequences. The evening city was bathed in the soft glow of street lamps, their reflections trembling on the wet asphalt, as if someone had scattered stars across the pavement. Victor stood in an empty apartment, surrounded by boxes he had not yet unpacked. His new life was beginning here, in a small studio on the outskirts of town, with windows overlooking a noisy street. The furniture was minimal: a bed, a table, a couple of chairs, everything he needed to start from scratch. He had taken nothing from his and Sarah's house, except a few books and an old leather briefcase his father had given him for graduation. The rest was hers, as he had promised. But standing in this bare room, he felt not loss, but a strange relief, as if he had lifted a burden he had been carrying for years. Victor and Alex never saw each other again after that fateful conversation in the park. Their strange union, born of shared pain and a desire to get to the truth, did not develop into friendship. They were too different. Victor was calm, thoughtful, with a habit of analyzing his every step. Alex was impulsive, living in the moment, easily switching from laughter to anger. But in their last conversation, when they shook hands goodbye, there was something that connected them stronger than friendship: respect. Respect for the fact that they were both able to look the truth in the eye, even if that truth was bitter. They did not exchange numbers, did not promise to keep in touch. They simply went their separate ways, each in their own direction, with the feeling that they had done what they had to. Victor made an appointment with a therapist the week after he moved. It wasn't Dr. Royce he didn't want his and Sarah's stories to intersect, even indirectly. His therapist, a woman named Elena, was older, with a soft voice and a habit of tilting her head slightly when she listened. In their first session, Victor said little, his words sparingly, as if he were afraid to let out too much pain. But Elena didn't rush him. She simply listened, and there was something about her silence that allowed him to breathe more freely. "What do you feel when you think about Sarah?" she asked in the second session, her voice soft but insistent. Victor thought, looking at his hands folded in his lap. "I don't know," he finally answered. "Before, I felt anger, pain, humiliation. But now it seems there's nothing, just emptiness, and maybe a little hope. Not that we'll be together, but that I can understand myself, understand why I let it go this far." Elena nodded, her eyes attentive but not judgmental. "It's a good start, Victor. Emptiness isn't always bad. Sometimes it's a place to start building something new." He wasn't sure he was ready to build anything new, but her words resonated with him. He began going to therapy once a week, and each session was a small step forward, not toward healing, but toward understanding. He talked about his marriage, about how he tried to be a good husband, about how he was afraid to see the truth about Sarah, about himself. He talked about the journal, about how her words had hurt him, but also made him think about who he was to her, and who he was to himself. In his new apartment, he began to find solace in the little things. He bought a coffee machine and made himself an espresso every morning, savoring the bitter aroma. He enrolled in photography classes, having once dreamed of taking landscape photos as a teenager, but having given up on them for the sake of adult life. He walked around the city, rediscovering it not as a backdrop to his routine, but as a place full of stories. And with each passing day, he felt the emptiness inside him begin to fill not with answers, but with possibilities. Sarah sat on the balcony of her apartment, looking out at a city that seemed alien to her. In front of her lay a new notebook, clean, with white pages that frightened her with their emptiness. Her old truth journal was hidden in a drawer, and she hadn't opened it since that meeting in the park. She couldn't. Every word she'd written there now seemed like a lie, not because she didn't feel what she was writing, but because she was using those words to justify her actions, to hide from the truth she didn't want to see. Victor left. He left her everything: the apartment, the car, even their joint bank account. But he took her illusions with him, just like he promised. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't make a scene. He just left, leaving her alone with herself. And that was worse than any scandal. She expected him to fight for her, to scream, to make her feel guilty. But he just left, and that silence was louder than any words. Alex had disappeared from her life, too. After he told his colleagues about their affair, the office had become a minefield for Sarah. The whispers behind her back, the curious glances, the awkward silences in conversations, all of it reminded her of how she had been exposed. She considered quitting, but instead took a leave of absence to sort myself out. But sorting myself out was harder than she expected. She sat in front of this empty notebook, holding a pen, but the words wouldn't come. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to write. She thought back to that encounter in the park, when Victor and Alex had forced her to look at herself. She tried to defend herself, to discount their words, but their truth was sharper than her own. Victor had read her diary aloud, and every word had been a slap in the face. Alex had added his own details, and his voice, usually light and mocking, was full of pain. She wanted to scream, she wanted to run, but instead she had fallen silent, and that silence was her admission, an admission that she had lied. Not just to them, but to herself. Now, sitting on the balcony, she felt naked, as if all the masks had been ripped off her. She was no longer a good wife. She was no longer a free woman. She was not even the Sarah who wrote in her diary about her loneliness. She was simply herself, and that was what scared her most of all, because she didn't know who she was. She opened her notebook, looked at the blank page, and wrote one word: why? Then she stopped, her hand still. Why had she done what she had done? Why had she allowed herself to hurt the people she loved? Why had she been so afraid of the truth? She didn't know the answers, but that word, that is why, was a start. Not an answer, but a question that might lead her to herself. Alex, unlike Victor, didn't seek therapy. He returned to his life, his parties, his friends, his job, which he was bored with, but had no intention of quitting. But something had changed in him. He was no longer looking for casual sex, no longer trying to fill the void with noise and alcohol. He thought about Sarah, about how she had made him feel alive, but also how she had used him. He thought about Victor, about his quiet determination, about his pain, which was so similar to his own. And he thought about himself, about why he had let himself get caught up in this. He didn't regret telling his colleagues the truth. It wasn't revenge, but a way to free himself. He was tired of being someone's secret, someone's escape. He wanted to be himself, even if it meant being alone. And maybe for the first time in his life, he began to ask himself who he wanted to be. Not for Sarah, not for anyone else, but for himself. Victor and Alex never saw each other again, but their last encounter left a mark on them both. They did not become friends, their worlds were too different. Their lives were going in opposite directions, but they left with respect for each other, with the understanding that the truth, no matter how painful, had set them free. They had both lost Sarah, but they had found something else themselves, or at least a way to themselves. Sarah was left alone, with an empty notebook and questions she didn't yet have answers to. She didn't know if she could forgive herself, if she could start over. But she knew one thing: her illusions were shattered, and now she would have to live with the truth. And maybe this was her chance, a chance to become who she'd always wanted to be, even if she didn't know who that was yet. Well, it's time to return to the real world. But reality is also history. Until the next episode. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.